What happens when the world's most polarizing duchess sits across from one of America's toughest interviewers under the unforgiving glare of live television? If you thought Meghan Markle's past sit-downs were fiery, you haven't seen her square off with George Stephanopoulos. Until now. What began as polite chatter quickly unraveled into pointed questions, sharp retorts, and a duel of words that left millions wondering if Meghan had finally met her match. The Good Morning America studio glowed in the early light. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, the Manhattan skyline gleaming against a flawless blue sky. Coffee mugs rested neatly on the desk, cameras hummed softly, and producers whispered behind their clipboards. This wasn't just another segment. This was Meghan Markle. She entered in a sleek black pantsuit, hair swept into a perfect bun, heels clicking across the polished floor with deliberate rhythm. George Stephanopoulos rose smoothly, hand extended, his broadcaster's smile practiced and steady. "Meghan, welcome," he said. "Of course," she replied, lowering into her chair with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Happy to be here." George shuffled his notes. His expression suggested this wouldn't be a soft celebrity profile. "You've been in the headlines for years," he began. "From Hollywood to royalty, to stepping back from the monarchy, to your work in the U.S., you've often spoken about your truth. But let me ask you, do you believe your truth has ever conflicted with the truth?" The studio murmured at the boldness of the opening shot. Meghan raised a brow, then laughed, sharp and brief. "My experiences can't be debated, George. They're mine. My truth is just that, mine. If that makes people uncomfortable, that's not my problem." George's pen scratched across his notepad. He didn't flinch. "Interesting answer," he said evenly. "But when it comes to the royal family, you've described them as cold, even cruel. Yet when pressed for names, dates, or evidence, you've avoided specifics. Some say that's convenient. Do you feel any responsibility for the damage your words may have caused?" Meghan's smile hardened. She leaned back, legs crossing with practiced ease. "Here we go. Another journalist trying to both sides racism and emotional neglect. Let me make this simple. It wasn't my job to protect the institution. It was their job to protect me. They failed." George leaned forward. "But Meghan, you also benefited enormously from that institution. The titles, the platform, the global attention. Isn't it contradictory to accept all of that, then tear it down?" Her laugh rang out, mocking this time. "Oh, George, that's such a tired line. People love to say, she wanted the fairy tale but couldn't handle the castle. Please, if you think my life was charmed, you weren't paying attention." The air in the studio grew taut. George set his cards down. "You've written books, filmed documentaries, produced podcasts, telling your story again and again. And yet, you say you want privacy. How do you reconcile that?" Meghan tilted her head, lips pursed. "Privacy doesn't mean silence. It means control. I decide what I share, when I share it, and how. That's called boundaries, something the press has never understood." George studied her in silence before answering. "Fair enough." His tone suggested otherwise. "Then let's talk about Harry." Meghan cut him off with a flick of her hand. "Let's not. He's been dragged into enough of these. This is about me, isn't it?" George's eyebrow lifted. His smile tightened. "It's about the story," he said calmly. "And Harry is part of that story." "Harry is my husband," Meghan shot back, her voice cutting now. "Not your headline." George didn't blink. "And yet, you've spent the last few years making your marriage very much part of the headlines," he replied, his tone dry. Meghan's lips pressed into a thin line. "What about before Harry?" George pressed on. "You were an actress on a moderately successful cable show. You once called that work something you were proud of. Yet since marrying into the royal family, you've dismissed it as insignificant. Do you see your acting career as something to celebrate? Or just a stepping stone?" Meghan let out a low, incredulous laugh. "You really do your homework, don't you?" she said, sarcasm dripping. "I've always been proud of my work, but it's fascinating how people like you love to diminish it. What was it you did before this? Clinton's communications guy, right? And now here you are, throwing stones at people who have actually built something meaningful." The jab landed. For the first time, George's expression flickered, but only for a moment. "Let me rephrase," he said smoothly. "Do you think the public's fascination with you comes from your accomplishments? Or from the controversy you've created?" Meghan leaned back, folding her arms, defiant. "The fascination comes from the fact that I speak truths most people are too afraid to say, and that makes a lot of people, including journalists like yourself, very uncomfortable." George didn't answer right away. He sat back, folding his hands, the corners of his mouth tightening into the faintest smile. The tension in the studio was palpable now. A duchess refusing to yield, and a journalist refusing to be charmed. And George wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his notes untouched, eyes locked on hers. "Let's circle back," he said evenly. "You've been clear about feeling unsupported by the royal family. But what about the British people? Many welcomed you warmly at first." "Do you believe you let them down by leaving?" Meghan laughed sharply. "Oh, George, don't pretend the British press speaks for the people. If they were disappointed, it's because they swallowed the lies they were spoon-fed. I don't owe anyone an apology for walking away from abuse." George nodded slowly, but his jaw tightened. "Interesting," he said, "because you often frame yourself as a symbol of fairness, compassion, even duty. And yet, some might argue that walking away from a commitment, even a painful one, is the opposite of duty." Meghan tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "So you think I should have stayed in a toxic environment just to keep others happy? Is that what you'd recommend to your daughters? Or is that advice only for women who marry into royalty?" The jab was sharp, but George didn't flinch. He even smiled faintly. "What I'd recommend," he said calmly, "is being honest about your choices and the consequences." For the first time, Meghan faltered. Just a flicker. George pressed in. "You've said you'd never feel safe returning to the UK. Do you truly believe that? Or is it possible you've exaggerated that claim to fit the narrative you've built for yourself?" Meghan's hands clenched in her lap. "George," she said coldly, "unless you've lived through the racism, the hatred, the relentless scrutiny I endured, I'd suggest you keep your theories about my safety to yourself," the audience murmured. But George didn't miss a beat. "I'm simply asking," he said evenly, "because the public deserves to know whether this is about genuine danger or about preserving your image as the eternal victim." Meghan scoffed, her laugh sharp. "My image? That's rich, coming from someone who built a career spinning narratives for politicians." The studio air thickened. Neither moved. It wasn't an interview anymore. It was a duel. That landed. George eased back in his chair, arms folded, eyes narrowing. "You're right," he said at last. "I've worked with politicians. I know how the game is played, which is why it's fascinating to watch someone like you, someone who claims to despise the media, play it better than most." Color crept into Meghan's cheeks. "Master it? You think being vilified daily, watching lies go unchecked, is mastery? That's not strategy, George. That's survival." His brow arched slightly. "Survival that happens to come with multi-million-dollar contracts, magazine covers, and documentaries where you're the heroine in every frame." Meghan leaned forward, her smile sharp and cold. "So what are you accusing me of? Exploiting my own pain? Making the best of a nightmare? I'm sorry if that offends your journalistic purity, but that's not exploitation. That's resilience." George tapped his pen against the desk, steady as a metronome. "Or," he murmured, "it's opportunism." The silence that followed was suffocating. Meghan's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the chair. "Careful, George," she said slowly. "You're starting to sound like one of those tabloids you claim to despise." For the first time, George chuckled, low, humorless. And you're starting to sound like someone convinced the world revolves around her grievances." Meghan's breath caught, her eyes blazing. "That's enough. You don't know me. You don't know what I've endured." "No," George agreed calmly. "But I do know what accountability looks like. And I haven't heard much of it here." The studio was frozen. Even the camera crew seemed transfixed by the clash unfolding before them. Meghan crossed her arms and leaned back, her expression a mask of defiance. George, by contrast, leaned in, his voice dropping colder. "Let's talk about Harry." Her head snapped up. "Don't!" The warning was sharp, but George pressed on. "You've said Harry supported you through everything, that he stood by you. But many see him as isolated now, cut off from family, from country. Do you feel any responsibility for that?" Meghan let out a scoff, half laugh, half snarl. "Predictable. Blame the woman. Blame the wife. Because obviously Harry couldn't make his own choices. Obviously he must have been manipulated. How very 1950s of you." George held her gaze unflinching. "I think the viewers can decide for themselves who's been manipulating whom." The silence was deafening. Meghan's eyes narrowed to slits. "You're unbelievable." George straightened his tie with practiced ease. "And you, Meghan, are exactly who I expected." The sun outside blazed against the studio windows, but inside the air was icy. What began as an interview had become an intellectual cage match, neither willing to yield, and just when it seemed the clash had reached its peak, George leaned forward once more. "You've spoken about leaving royal life to rediscover yourself, your voice, your independence. But looking at the years since, I don't see independence. I see someone who traded one stage for another, one palace for another. So tell me, Meghan, who's really in control here? You or the narrative you've built around yourself?" Meghan's laugh was humorless, her voice steeped in contempt. "That's rich, coming from a man who spent his career criticizing others, pretending he's above it all. You don't know me, George. You don't know what it's like to have the world against you." George tilted his head, eyes cold, steady. "I don't need to know you. I've seen this before, and I know what narcissism looks like when it's dressed up as victimhood." The word struck like a slap. Meghan's eyes widened, lips parting as though she couldn't quite believe it. "Narcissism," she echoed, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You dare sit there and call me a narcissist?" Meghan shot back, her voice rising. "Because I refuse to be silent? Because I refuse to let others write my story?" George's gaze was steady, almost pitying. "No," he said quietly. "Because every question, every criticism, every challenge, you meet it with indignation, with blame, with condescension. It's always someone else's fault. Always someone else who's cruel or ignorant or racist. But never you. Not once have I heard you say, 'Maybe I mishandled that. Maybe I hurt someone too.' That's not strength, Meghan. That's denial." The air in the studio tightened, suffocating. Meghan's chest rose and fell quickly as she glared across the table. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. "You think you're exposing me. But all you've done is prove why women like me stay quiet, why we smile, why we swallow it, while men like you tear us apart for sport." George shook his head slowly. His tone remained calm, deliberate. "This isn't sport. This is journalism. This is asking the questions others won't, because they're afraid of being called cruel or misogynistic or racist. But someone has to ask. The public deserves answers. And what I see here," he gestured toward her, almost reluctantly, "is someone who doesn't have them." That broke her. Meghan shoved her chair back with a metallic screech. "I don't have to sit here and be insulted," she snapped. "I don't have to justify my life to someone who came here with an agenda to humiliate me." George raised an eyebrow. "Not to humiliate you," he corrected softly. "To hold you accountable, something no one else seems willing to do." Meghan stood tall, straightening her black pantsuit, chin lifted despite the redness creeping into her face. "This was a mistake," she spat. "I thought this was going to be a real conversation. Instead, it's just another man trying to control the narrative." George didn't move, didn't blink. "No," he said simply. "This was a real conversation. You just didn't like where it went." Her fists clenched. For a heartbeat, it looked like she might lash out again. But instead, she shook her head sharply and stormed off stage. The echo of her heels rang through the frozen silence. George sat alone, letting the moment breathe. He adjusted his tie, then turned to the camera, his voice low, steady. "To our viewers," he began, "I apologize for the abrupt end, but I believe you deserve to see conversations like this for what they are. Not polished PR, not rehearsed narratives. Truth, even when it's uncomfortable." He paused, eyes locked on the lens. "Perhaps especially when it's uncomfortable." Behind the cameras, producers whispered urgently about sponsors, timing, moving on. George ignored them. His voice grew firmer. "There is a difference," he said, "between being a victim and making victimhood a brand, between seeking justice and seeking attention. That line is being blurred, not just here, but everywhere." He leaned back at last, pen forgotten on the desk. And we should all be asking why. The studio remained heavy with silence, the kind that follows history. George exhaled slowly as though weighing how far to press. His tone softened, but only slightly. "I want to be clear," he said. "No one denies that Meghan endured challenges. No one denies that racism, cruelty, and relentless scrutiny exist, and that they cut deeply. But what we cannot do, what I refuse to do, is let those truths become shields that deflect all accountability. That's not how trust is built. That's not how healing happens." By now the internet was already ablaze. Hashtags trended. Clips of the clash spread like wildfire. Some praised George's steel. Others accused him of cruelty. The studio's phone lines glowed red. George glanced at his notes, then pushed them aside. "I've interviewed presidents, generals, CEOs, and I've learned this. Power doesn't just come from armies or wealth. Sometimes it comes from a story. A narrative so carefully crafted that people are afraid to question it. But my job is to question it anyway." He leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "I hope Meghan Markle finds the peace she's looking for. Truly. But today reminded me why this work matters. Because if we stop asking hard questions, if we stop expecting honesty and consistency from those in the spotlight, we all lose." The control room cued the next segment. A breezy cooking demo. George raised a hand. "Wait." "And to our viewers," he said, quieter now but unyielding, "thank you for trusting us to have the tough conversations. They're not always easy. They're not always pretty. But they are necessary." He straightened his papers, gave the camera a faint nod. "We'll be right back." His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, but not regret. The screen cut to commercial. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Meghan was already gone. She'd refused the waiting car, storming off with her entourage. Her PR rep was drafting a statement, certain to blame the tone, the questions, perhaps even the network itself. In the control room, producers tracked the flood of live feedback. Emails, tweets, call-ins. The country was split down the middle, half hailing George as a rare truth-teller, half condemning him as a bully. George pulled out his earpiece, rubbed his face, and rose. A producer hurried over, nerves in her smile. "You okay?" "I've been better," he smirked faintly. "But I've been worse." He gathered his notes, straightened his jacket, and walked off set. His phone buzzed with messages. Journalists, pundits, colleagues, all weighing in. But George didn't answer. Not yet. Not until he watched the footage back himself and judged whether he had done his job, and done it well. Outside, New York was blindingly bright. Sliding on his sunglasses, George Stephanopoulos stepped into the street. In that moment, he was many things. Respected journalist, controversial interviewer, lightning rod of praise and outrage. But above all else, he was unflinching.